"She's not wanted here, let her sit with the staff," my brother's wife spat as she made two ushers shove me into the kitchen. I didn't get upset, I just made one call: cancel the $30 million contract. My brother turned ghost white, the bride choked on her wine. They realized they'd just lost their empire. "My name's Hannah Blake, I'm 32 years old." The wedding invitation arrived in a plain white envelope tucked between a credit card offer and a coupon booklet. My address was printed in a stark black font, no elegant calligraphy for me. It felt less like an invitation and more like a summons, a legal notice I was compelled to acknowledge. My brother Mark Blake was marrying Valerie Davenport, a woman whose name was synonymous with old money and industrial power. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a merger, a strategic alliance designed to cement my family's long, desperate social climb. The paper felt thin and cheap in my hands, a clear signal of my status in the proceedings. I was an afterthought, a box to be checked. A week later, Mom called. Her voice had that bright, brittle tone she used when she was about to issue a directive she expected me to resent. She didn't ask if I was coming. That was a foregone conclusion. She was calling to dictate the terms of my attendance. "Hannah, just try to look presentable," she'd said, the words clipped and precise. "No worn sneakers, please. This is important for your brother." Each word was a tiny, sharp jab, a reminder of all the ways I'd failed to meet her expectations. She managed to slip in a reference to me dropping out of med school, her favorite shorthand for my entire life's trajectory. To her, I was and always would be the brilliant daughter who threw it all away. I listened, my eyes drifting to the complex schematics spread across my desk. They were beautiful in their intricacy, a web of logic and power that would soon become the beating heart of a new generation of electronics. These were the custom microchip designs for Davenport Group, the very company my brother was marrying into. They were bleeding cash, desperate for a win, and my company, Northstar Dynamics, was the anonymous supplier poised to save their entire empire. They had no idea the dropout in the worn sneakers was the architect of their salvation. The irony was so thick I could taste it. "I'll be there," I told her, my voice perfectly neutral. "I won't be a problem." It was the absolute truth, just not in the way she understood it. Later that week, a restless energy pulled me into my car and onto the familiar roads of my childhood. I drove past my parents' house, slowing to a crawl. The garden was a masterpiece of control, each rosebush pruned to perfection, the lawn an unnaturally vibrant green carpet. It was a perfect reflection of the life they curated, beautiful on the surface, with no room for a single weed to grow. I remembered being 12, standing in that same yard while Dad explained why I had to let Mark take full credit for the science fair project we'd built together. "It's just easier, Hannah," he'd said, his eyes pleading. "Just keep the peace." The family motto wasn't "I love you," it was "Don't make us look bad." My mind drifted from their sterile house to the place that felt more like home than any other. The cold, dusty garage I'd rented 10 years ago, I could still conjure the smell of it, a mix of metallic solder, stale coffee, and the faint, electric scent of ozone from an overworked circuit board. That garage was my sanctuary. It was where I'd spent countless nights fueled by ambition and cheap takeout, building the foundations of Northstar Dynamics. It was the one place they couldn't touch, a world I had built where their judgment had no currency. Mom's voice echoed in my head, a memory from a Christmas dinner years ago. I'd shown up in a hoodie and jeans, exhausted from a 72-hour work binge. She'd looked me up and down with pure disdain. "Honestly, Hannah," she'd said to my aunt, loud enough for me to hear, "you belong by the service entrance." She wasn't trying to be funny. I still had the original workbench from that garage. It sat in my spacious corner office, a massive slab of scarred and stained wood against a wall of pure glass. It was a quiet, constant reminder of who I was and where I came from. This wedding wasn't just a family gathering. It was a stage, and they had already cast me in my usual role, the disappointment. The first hint of trouble came not with a bang but with a quiet, professional phone call. It was from Kelsey Morgan, my assistant, a woman whose calm efficiency was the bedrock of my day-to-day operations. She was sharp, fiercely loyal, and one of only 3 people in the world who knew that I was the true owner of Northstar Dynamics, not just a mid-level consultant as the public records suggested. "There's a flag on the vendor manifests," she said, her voice even, but I could detect a sliver of concern. "Minor data scraping, looks like a competitor is fishing for our suppliers." Data scraping wasn't unusual, but the target was. "Which manifests?" I asked, already feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "The component lists for the Davenport contract," she confirmed. "It was too specific to be random. This wasn't a competitor casting a wide net. This was a targeted strike." My uncle, Alan Crane, the man I'd chosen to be the public face of Northstar Dynamics, would have a full-blown panic attack if he heard about this. He was a good man and a great salesman, but he didn't have the stomach for this kind of corporate warfare. My job was to neutralize threats before they ever reached his desk. "Lock down the servers," I told Kelsey. "Full diagnostic trace on all recent access points. I want to know who looked at that data when they looked at it and where it went. And Kelsey, keep this between us." She didn't hesitate. "Of course." The list of people with high-level clearance to access that specific data was short, alarmingly short. It included me, Dana Collier, my operations chief, and a handful of senior engineers who wouldn't know how to sell data if their lives depended on it. And then there was the logistics department at the subsidiary that handled shipping. A cold feeling, sharp as ice, settled in my gut. This didn't feel like a simple case of corporate espionage. It felt personal. An hour later, I was sliding into a worn vinyl booth at a nondescript coffee shop halfway across town. The air smelled of burnt coffee and cleaning solution. Across from me sat Noah Pierce, the lead auditor from Clearline Audits, a firm I kept on a quiet, expensive retainer for exactly these moments. Noah was a ghost, the best there was at finding trails that didn't want to be found. He had a perpetually tired look, but his eyes missed nothing. I didn't waste time with small talk. I slid a slim, encrypted tablet across the sticky table. "Find out who's accessing this, Noah, and where the data is going. I need it yesterday." He didn't ask why the anonymous owner of a multi-billion-dollar corporation was meeting him in person over a potential data leak. He wasn't paid to ask questions. He just gave a slight nod, slipped the tablet into his worn leather briefcase, and was gone. Back in the quiet sanctuary of my office, I pulled up the Davenport contract on my monitor. $49.6 million. To Northstar, it was a healthy but not company-altering deal. To Davenport Group, it was a lifeline. I'd read their quarterly reports. They were a mess, a dumpster fire of mismanagement disguised by a legacy brand name. 3 major product launches had failed spectacularly in the last 12 months, costing them hundreds of millions. They were bleeding cash at a terrifying rate. Their patriarch, Franklin Davenport, Valerie's father, was an old-school tycoon who believed that the louder he shouted, the faster problems would be solved. He was a dinosaur and he was desperate. This data leak in his hands could give him leverage to renegotiate the price, or worse, a roadmap to steal our designs and cut us out entirely. The knot in my stomach tightened. This was more than a leak, it was a potential kill shot. As if on cue, my phone buzzed, displaying a picture of Mom. I let out a slow breath and answered. This time, the topic was the wedding gift. "We've all put in for a European honeymoon for Mark and Valerie," she announced, as if she were conveying a royal decree. "Your share is $5,000. It wasn't a suggestion or a request. It was an invoice for family participation. I could easily afford it, but the assumption, the demand, grated on me. "I was planning on getting them my own gift," I said, trying to keep my voice even. Her sigh was a weapon she had perfected over 3 decades. "Hannah, don't be difficult. Honestly, you're part of this family even if you don't act like it. It's the least you can do after all the trouble you've caused us." There it was again. Trouble, dropping out of med school, not becoming the doctor she could brag about at her country club, not being the perfect, pliant daughter she could mold and display. Arguing was pointless. It was like arguing with the tide. Fine, I said, I'll transfer the money. I hung up and did it immediately, a $5,000 transaction to make the problem go away. But as the confirmation screen glowed on my phone, the data leak and my mother's words twisted together in my mind. Family, trouble, betrayal, they were all starting to feel like the same thing. 2 days later, Noah called. He didn't bother with a greeting. The data went to a public relations firm, Lawson and Associates. It was drip-fed over a period of 3 weeks from an internal login made to look like routine data checks. My blood ran cold. I knew that name. Trent Lawson, I asked, already certain of the answer. That's the one, Noah confirmed. Trent Lawson, a public relations executive known for his slick, underhanded tactics, was also Valerie Davenport's cousin. The connection was direct and damning. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the next question, the one that mattered most. "Whose login, Noah?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if he understood the weight of the information he was about to deliver. "The credentials belong to Mark Blake. He's listed as head of logistics at your North Shore subsidiary. My brother." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. Mark, the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. He had used the very job I had secured for him, a position created to give him a respectable title and an inflated salary, to betray my company. My own brother was the mole. The cold feeling in my gut coalesced into a block of solid ice. Noah wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, his voice grim. "While we were tracing the data packets, we found some financial irregularities in his department. Invoices that don't match payment logs, vendor accounts that don't seem to exist. The data leak wasn't the main crime. It was a cover, a symptom of a much deeper rot he was stealing." "I want every single dollar traced," I said, my voice hardening into something I barely recognized. "I want to know where it went, what he spent it on, everything." The phone felt like a lead weight in my hand after I hung up. This was no longer just business. My family had always treated me like an outsider, but I never imagined my own brother would actively work to destroy everything I had built. This was a reckoning. That night, sleep was impossible. Instead of tossing and turning, I went to my office and turned the glass wall of my conference room into a massive whiteboard. I didn't map out the data leak. I mapped out Davenport Group's entire corporate existence. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their finances, their key personnel. After hours of analysis, their Achilles heel became glaringly obvious: their supply chain. They had streamlined to the point of fragility, relying on just 3 key suppliers for the specialized materials that were essential for nearly all of their products. An interruption from even one of them would cripple their manufacturing capabilities within a week. At 2 a.m, I called Julia Park, my lead counsel for Crane Holdings, the parent company through which I controlled North Star. She was a brilliant, tireless lawyer who had long ago gotten used to my nocturnal work habits. "Julia," I said, skipping the pleasantries, "I need you to quietly acquire 3 companies for me. And I need it done by the end of the week. I also need a complete breakdown of who holds Davenport Group's debt." She didn't ask why. She didn't question the insane timeline. She simply said, "Send me the company names." The plan was crystallizing in my mind, cold and sharp. This wasn't just about plugging a leak anymore. This was about seizing control of the entire narrative. If I owned their critical suppliers, I could turn off the tap whenever I wanted. If I owned a significant portion of their debt, I could call their loans due, forcing them into a corner from which there was no escape. Mark, Franklin, and the whole smug Davenport clan thought they were playing checkers, stealing a few of my pieces off the board. I was about to overturn the entire chessboard. It would be an expensive, audacious move, but the price of finally freeing myself from my family's suffocating story was one I was more than willing to pay. The rehearsal dinner was held at the sprawling Davenport estate, a monument to inherited wealth and questionable taste. I walked through the massive oak doors wearing a simple, elegant black dress, but on my feet I wore my old, worn-in sneakers. It was a small, silent act of defiance, a statement that only I would understand. Mom's eyes narrowed the second she saw my footwear, a flicker of pure fury crossing her face. "Couldn't you have tried, Hannah?" she hissed under her breath. "Just for one night." I just smiled faintly and walked past her. A moment later, Mark clapped me on the shoulder a little too hard, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "Glad you could make it, sis," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Try not to embarrass us." Valerie, his fiancée, floated over and gave me an air kiss that landed a full 6 inches from my cheek, her smile as brittle as spun sugar. She and Mark exchanged a quick, knowing look. They were sharing a private joke at my expense, so sure of their place at the top of the world. Franklin Davenport, the patriarch, ignored me completely. He was holding court with a circle of investors, his voice booming across the perfectly manicured lawn. I found a quiet corner, took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, and just watched them. I watched the casual cruelty, the dismissive glances, the unshakable, smug confidence that radiated from every one of them. To them, I wasn't a threat, I wasn't even a person. I was a ghost at their feast, a family footnote they were forced to tolerate. Later, I drifted near a group of Mark's friends and overheard him bragging to Trent Lawson. "She's harmless," Mark was saying, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "Still thinks she can make it on her own with that little consulting gig of hers." They shared a condescending laugh. They had no idea I already had made it. And that by the time this weekend was over, I was going to own every single one of them. The full audit report from Noah arrived in my encrypted inbox the morning after the dinner. I read it in my office, the city still dark outside my window, and the cold anger from the night before sharpened into a diamond-hard rage. It was so much worse than I had imagined. Mark hadn't just skimmed a little off the top. Over the last 8 months, he had methodically embezzled $247,500. The report was a masterclass in petty fraud. He had created ghost vendors, companies that existed only as a mailing address and a bank account he controlled. He had padded legitimate invoices, approving payments for 10 times the actual cost and pocketing the difference. He had routed the stolen money through a complex web of shell accounts, but he'd been sloppy, arrogant. He thought no one was watching. He never in his wildest dreams imagined that I, his harmless sister, would be. Noah's team had unraveled it all. The report was airtight, filled with transaction logs, bank statements, and copies of the falsified invoices. The final pages detailed where the money had gone, a series of high-stakes online gambling sites. He wasn't just a thief, he was a gambling addict, and a desperate one at that. He hadn't sold my company's data for a simple, one-time payday. He was deep in a hole, stealing from the company I built to cover his massive losses. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated pattern of theft and deception. My brother, the family's golden boy, the one my parents had always championed, was nothing more than a common thief. In that moment, sitting alone in the dark, any lingering shred of familial duty, any whisper of guilt that maybe I was the problem, it all evaporated. The anger I felt was cold, clean, and clarifying. He hadn't just betrayed me, he had handed me the perfect weapon. A few hours later, as the sun began to rise, an email from Julia Park lit up my screen. The acquisitions were complete. Through a series of discrete transactions, Crane Holdings was now the sole owner of Apex Materials, Gencor Fabrications, and Microalloys, the 3 pillars holding up the entire Davenport Group manufacturing empire. Her next email confirmed the second part of the plan. We had successfully bought up $186 million of Davenport Group's debt from 4 different lenders. It was more than enough. Their catastrophic quarterly losses meant they were already in violation of several clauses in their loan agreements. With the amount of debt we now held, we could trigger those clauses and demand immediate repayment, effectively giving us total control over the company's fate. All the pieces were on the board, positioned exactly where I wanted them. I spent the afternoon in a secure conference room with Dana Collier, my unflappable operations chief. Dana had been with me since the garage days, and she understood my way of thinking better than anyone. I walked her through a detailed contingency plan, giving it the codename Redline. I explained that, at some point in the next 24 hours, I would send her a single 2-word text message. On that signal, and only on that signal, she was to halt the $49.6 million microchip shipment destined for Davenport Group, not delay it, halt it, indefinitely. She looked at the plan, then looked at me, her expression serious. She saw the gravity in my eyes, the cold resolve. She didn't ask a single question about why, she just nodded. Understood, she said, that was it, just trust. It was the foundation of everything I had built at North Star, and it was the polar opposite of anything I had ever received from my own family. That evening, the day before his wedding, my phone rang. It was Mark. His voice was oozing a false sincerity that made my skin crawl. "Hey, sis," he said, his tone unnaturally warm. "Just wanted to call and say I know we haven't always seen eye to eye. But it really means a lot that you're coming tomorrow." He was laying the groundwork, trying to soften me up, building a plausible defense in case his scheme unraveled. He was treating me like I was stupid. "It's a big day, Mark," I said, keeping my voice a carefully constructed wall of neutrality. Then he made his final, fatal mistake. "Yeah, it is," he said, trying to sound casual. "And hey, that big Davenport deal your company is working on, it's huge for us. Franklin is thrilled, it's really saving our skins over here." He was fishing. He was trying to confirm that the deal was still on track, that his betrayal hadn't been discovered. He saw North Star, my life's work, as nothing more than a resource to be plundered for his own benefit, just like he saw me. A deep, final cold settled over me. "I'm sure it is," I replied, and before he could say another word, I ended the call. That was it. That was the last bridge, and he had just torched it himself. He wasn't just my brother anymore, he was my antagonist. And I was ready for the final act. The morning of the wedding was bright and clear. I stood in front of my walk-in closet, the sheer volume of clothing feeling absurd. My hand hovered over a dress I'd bought for the occasion, an elegant, understated silk sheath in a deep sapphire blue. It was expensive, appropriate, and exactly what my mother would want me to wear. I imagined putting it on, playing the part of the respectable, if slightly disappointing, daughter one last time. Smiling for the pictures, making small talk, pretending everything was fine. And then I turned away from it. Instead, I reached for a simple, dark pantsuit. The tailoring was sharp, the lines clean and severe. It was professional, it was armor. And on my feet, I slipped on the very same worn sneakers my mother so despised. This wasn't a family event for me. This was a hostile takeover. I was dressing for the boardroom, not the ballroom. When I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I didn't see the family mistake. I saw the chief executive officer of North Star Dynamics. In that moment, my objective shifted. The goal was no longer just to expose Mark. That was too small, too petty. The new goal was to perform a surgical removal of the rot from both families and, in the process, save the 2,400 jobs at Davenport Group that were at stake. I would not let that company collapse under the weight of their incompetence and corruption. I would rebuild it. This was my irreversible choice. I wasn't just going to hurt them, I was going to replace them. I sat down not at my sleek, modern desk, but at the old, scarred workbench I kept by the window. I laid out 2 simple folders on its rough surface. One contained Noah's complete audit of Mark's embezzlement, a damning chronicle of his greed and deception. The other held the documents Julia had prepared, the legal paperwork to terminate the supplier contracts and call in the $186 million of debt. Using them would mean the absolute end of my family as I knew it. Any slim, fantastical chance of some future reconciliation would be vaporized. The thought of my dad's face when he found out, the image of his quiet disappointment turning into brokenness, was a sharp pain in my chest. Mom would be apoplectic, her rage a hurricane. Mark would be utterly and completely ruined. This was the personal cost, and I had to look at it to feel its weight. To win this war, I had to accept the loss of my family. But what was I really losing? A mother who saw me only as a source of shame, a father who always chose peace over principle, a brother who stole from me without a second thought. The choice was stark. Their undeserved comfort or my hard-won truth, their lies or my life's work. I picked up my phone and called my uncle Alan. I didn't give him the details, just the warning. Alan, there's a major restructuring coming today. It's going to be disruptive, but it's necessary. I need you to trust me and be ready for my call. There was a moment of silence and I could picture him, worried but resolute. You've never steered us wrong, Hannah, he said finally. His simple, unwavering trust was a stark contrast to a lifetime of my family's doubt. It was the final push I needed. My revenge would not be a messy, tearful shouting match in the middle of a wedding reception. It would be a business decision executed with the cold precision of a surgeon. This wasn't just about making them pay, it was about creating something better and more stable from the wreckage they had created. I would expose Mark's theft not merely for retribution, but as the legal and moral justification for removing him from any position of power forever. I would trigger the takeover not to bankrupt the Davenports and gloat over their ruin, but to save their company from their own catastrophic mismanagement. The thousands of employees at Davenport Group, the engineers, the factory workers, the administrative staff, they didn't deserve to lose their livelihoods because of the greed and ego in the executive suite. My new, bolder goal was clear in my mind: take everything, fire the poison, protect the innocent. It was a clean revenge, precise, and it would be far more permanent than any emotional outburst. I slipped the 2 folders into my briefcase, snapped it shut, and walked out the door. I was no longer just attending a wedding. I was heading to a closing. I arrived at the Grand Hotel ballroom and was immediately hit by a wall of sensory overload. The ceilings were draped in white silk, massive crystal chandeliers dripped light onto an ocean of white roses, and at least 500 guests, all clad in expensive tuxedos and glittering gowns, mingled and laughed. It was a spectacle of wealth and power. I made my way to the ornate seating chart displayed on a golden easel near the entrance. I scanned the list. Table 1, the head table, featured the Blakes and the Davenports. The subsequent tables were filled with a who's who of the city's financial and social elite. My name was nowhere to be found. Before I could process it, a young usher with a practiced, polite smile approached me. Miss Blake, your seat is this way. He had clearly been given specific instructions. He led me away from the beautifully decorated tables, past the clatter of the bar, toward the back of the enormous room. He stopped near the swinging double doors that led to the kitchen, the scent of hot food and the faint sound of clanging pots leaking through. He pointed to a single, solitary folding chair tucked awkwardly beside a stack of spare tablecloths. It was a direct, public message from my mother, a perfect, cruel echo of her words from that long-ago Christmas: "You belong by the service entrance." I glanced across the room and saw her watching me, a flicker of cold triumph in her eyes. From the head table, Mark and Valerie shot me a shared, condescending smirk. They had put me in my place. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue or cause a scene. I walked over, sat down in the cold metal chair, smoothed my pantsuit, and took out my phone. I opened a new text message to Dana Collier, my operations chief. My fingers typed 2 words. The text said, "Execute red line." I hit send. The wedding ceremony passed in a hazy blur. I watched from my folding chair in the back as my brother and Valerie exchanged vows, their voices ringing with hollow words about trust, honor, and forever. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. During the cocktail hour that followed, as the string quartet played something light and cheerful, I saw Franklin Davenport's phone buzz. He glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance on his face, and then it buzzed again, insistently. His expression shifted from celebratory to concerned. He excused himself from his circle of guests, his voice low and angry as he spoke into the phone. A moment later, I saw his chief operating officer hurry across the ballroom, his face pale, and begin whispering urgently in Franklin's ear. The color drained from Franklin's face. He knew the $49.6 million shipment of North Star microchips, the shipment his company's very survival depended on, had been canceled, terminated without explanation. He looked around the room, his eyes wide with a dawning panic, scanning for anyone who could fix this impending disaster. His frantic gaze passed right over me, sitting quietly by the kitchen doors. I was invisible to him. Just the embarrassing sister on the folding chair. I watched him force a smile, trying to pretend that his world wasn't actively crumbling around him, but the panic was a visible tremor in his hands. The first domino had fallen. The chaos was beginning quietly, precisely, and right on schedule. They never thought to look for power in the places they dismissed. That was their fatal mistake. The toasts began, each one more sycophantic than the last. But Franklin wasn't listening. He couldn't hide his panic any longer. He strode over to my parents' table, his face a thundercloud. I couldn't hear his exact words, but I saw him gesturing wildly, his voice a low, angry growl. My father looked utterly bewildered. My mother's face was a mask of pure horror as her perfect event began to unravel. Mark, seeing the commotion, joined them, his face a perfect mask of fake concern. "What's wrong, Franklin?" he asked, placing a hand on the older man's arm. Franklin shook it off. "Your supplier," he snarled, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "North Star Dynamics, they just canceled the entire contract." "No reason given, we're ruined." That was my cue. I pushed my folding chair back, the sound scraping loudly in the sudden lull of conversation. I stood up and began walking toward them, my worn sneakers silent on the plush carpet. The short journey felt like a mile, every eye in the room following me. "There was a reason, Franklin," I said. My voice was calm and clear, but it cut through the nervous murmuring like a knife. He spun around, his eyes blazing with fury. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "My name is Hannah Blake," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "And North Star Dynamics is my company." A ripple of audible gasps spread out from our group. The string quartet faltered and fell silent. Phones, which had been politely tucked away, began to emerge. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Franklin stared at me, his mind clearly struggling to connect the dropout sister with the multi-billion-dollar corporation. "You're lying," he sputtered. "Am I?" I said, turning my gaze to my brother, whose face had gone the color of ash. "Mark, why don't you tell him about the vendor files you sold to his nephew?" Mark's face lost every color at once, like someone had bled the life out of a portrait. Valerie's perfect smile degraded into a thin line. Trent Lawson, who'd been hovering near the catering staff with the practiced air of someone who never lifted a hand, paled and took an involuntary step back. Around us, phones came up in a slow, mechanical wave, a dozen different screens focused on me at once. The hum of the room stilled into a buzz of recording devices and sharp, whispered questions. My mother made a sound that was almost a sob and then a furious bark. "Hannah, stop this, you're making a scene." Her voice was flint and glass. My dad looked as if someone had shoved him into the middle of a nightmare he couldn't wake from. "No, Mom," I said, and the word felt like a small stone I dropped into the middle of a pond. Ripples spread out, people leaning in, ears attuned to the quiet center of whatever would come next. I held up my phone and flicked through a summary Noah had messaged me. The screen glowed. The report, the logs, the chain of transfers, none of it was dramatic. It was bureaucratic, ugly in its own way. "This isn't gossip. It's an audit," I said. "Mark sold our vendor lists to Trent's firm. He used his login. He also siphoned off money from invoices to pay for gambling. That money went into accounts he controlled. It's all here." A woman at the next table let out a breathy, involuntary laugh that sounded like a sob. Trent's jaw clenched so hard his Adam's apple bobbed. Mark tried to open his mouth. For a moment, he just made a noise that could have been a word and wasn't. He looked at me, at the sister he'd been raised to love and protect, and hate and pity and fear all flashed in his eyes. Around him, his friends folded their arms, moved away, tried to make themselves small. Valerie's hand found his elbow and squeezed as if physical contact could anchor them. Franklin's face, lined and ruddy with years of confidence, was a study in collapse. His chin trembled. "This is preposterous," he managed finally, the words brittle. "You can't, you can call it whatever you like," I said. I felt a calmness settle over me, not the nervous heat of revenge, but the cool clarity of someone following a plan. I let the room drink it in before I moved to the next lever. "But there's more than Mark's theft. My company didn't just sell you chips. My holding company has been quietly buying up your suppliers and a large slice of your loans. Apex Materials, Gencor, Microalloys, all ours now." I pronounced each name like a bell. People shifted, glasses clinked as hands tightened on stems. "And my counsel," I said, nodding toward the doorway where Julia Park had just stepped in, composed and severe, "has the paperwork to prove it." A tremor ran through the head table. Franklin's face went ashen. His investors around him murmured. The gossip chain spread, quick and hungry. My dad took a step forward, a reflexive move like he could shield the family from the facts, but his arm faltered halfway. "Hannah, what are you doing?" he whispered, as if the question might alone stop whatever machine I had switched on. "I'm undoing the thing you all pretended didn't exist," I said. "You're standing in a ballroom built on an unsustainable company and a lot of arrogance. When you miss your numbers, who's footing the bill? The workers on the line, the small vendors who can't survive a missed payment. I can't let that happen because of them." Mark's face crumpled in a way that made my stomach twist. He'd thought he was using me as a resource, a bank with a familiar last name. I had let him think that. He'd underestimated exactly how much of the board he was gambling with. Julia's heels clicked on the carpet as she came to stand beside me. She didn't need to speak. The presence of counsel did what 1,000 words couldn't, officialized the moment. I reached for the second folder, the legal one, and held it where people could see. "We didn't just buy suppliers," I said. "We also bought enough of your loans to control outcomes. Those loans have rules. When a company misses the marks in its reports, lenders can demand immediate payment. Those rules let lenders call the loans. We bought enough of that debt to make it happen now." I explained it in plain terms, the lender's rules, the missing targets, the authority we'd bought, nothing fancy, nothing papered over. The guests were no longer murmuring. They were listening the way people listen to a verdict. Franklin found his voice, a low, dangerous animal. "You can't just, who gave you the right? Who are you to?" "I'm the person holding the banknotes," I said. My voice didn't rise. "It didn't need to. You've been living on borrowed time and borrowed money. I own a big enough piece of your loans that I can demand repayment now, not in 30 days, not in some bureaucratic future, today. I can make your lenders call what's owed, and your company will have to answer to them." He looked around desperately for someone, an ally, a partner, a friendly face that could reassure him that this was a mistake. But the room was a ring of mirrors showing him his own panic. Investors edged toward exits, their faces serious. Phones were out, the feeds already streaming his humiliation to anyone who cared to watch. "Do we want to be reasonable?" I asked, softer this time, addressing Franklin but really addressing everyone. "Do we want to avoid company-wide layoffs? Do we want to keep people working?" The crowd shifted. The question landed like a stone. It made them all lean forward. Franklin's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He understood immediately what I was offering and what it cost him. He spat. "What do you want?" I could have said anything, a laugh, an insult, a demand that would have ruined him utterly, but superiority isn't as satisfying as control. "I want stability," I said. "I want accountability. I've seen factories shut because of people like you, people who put image over product. Here are my terms." I listed them calmly because the room needed the rhythm of facts to steady itself. "You resign as chief executive, effective immediately. Valerie is removed from any board position tied to the company. Mark is fired for embezzlement. I will appoint an interim management team from North Star to run things during a full restructuring. We will protect the factories and the workers, that's all." I let the simplicity of it hang there. It was both surgical and merciful in the ways that mattered. Franklin's laugh was a short, ugly sound. That's extortion, he said, eyes wild. You're holding our loans as a weapon. Security, call security, I said, looking him straight in the face. But understand this, if anyone uses force to remove me, my counsel and I will call the lenders and tell them the company is in immediate default. They'll demand repayment and stop any payment flow. You'll have no governance, no funds to keep plants running. You'll have legal battles and lawsuits and media frenzy that will bury you. It's your choice. Scenes or a clean handover? He was livid, cornered, and grasping. Around us, people were no longer hidden by polite smiles. They were calculating. Somewhere, someone began to whisper about lawyers, about shareholder meetings, about emergency calls. My dad's face had drained of color. Mom's hands were clenched so tight the knuckles showed white. Mark began to tremble as if the floor itself disagreed with him. After a long, ragged pause, Franklin's shoulders slumped. He looked like a man who had just watched the foundation of his life pulled out from beneath him. Fine, he said finally, the word more like a surrender than a concession. Fine, you'll get your management, but this isn't over. We'll fight this? Of course you'll try, I said. You will try because it's all you know, but you can't threaten people with losing their paychecks and expect the rest of the world to applaud you. I folded my arms. We have 3 weeks until a formal vote, but with the debt we hold, it's a formality. We'll move quickly. We'll protect the workers. We'll rebuild properly. The crowd was still, but the tension in the air shifted from fear to a prickly, anticipatory energy. Cameras clicked, hands wrote notes, lips formed questions. My voice was steady, my purpose clear, and then the silence hit. It wasn't immediate, it crept over the room in layers. First, the string quartet paused mid-phrase, then abandoned the music entirely. Conversations thinned. The clatter of silverware slowed until it was a faint, embarrassed rustle. 500 people who had been laughing and toasting an hour ago were now frozen, their attention fixed squarely on me. I had expected cheers or outrage or perhaps a slender thread of support from some estranged uncle or sympathetic cousin. Instead, there was air, cold and thin, moving where sound had been. It was a victory, all right, but it felt like stepping into a room after a fire and realizing the ash is all that's left. I had taken away their power. They were uncomfortable with the vacuum. My mother looked like someone who'd been robbed of a script she'd been rehearsing her whole life. Her face was a paper mask of shocked outrage. My dad stood a little behind her, small, as if trying to make himself less visible to a world that had suddenly turned stormy and dangerous. Mark had been steadied by Valerie's arm, but his eyes were wild, almost unrecognizable. People who had once smiled at me at PTA meetings or business breakfasts looked away, as if my presence now made them complicit. No one moved toward me. No one said, "Well done," or "You did what had to be done." Instead, the room held its breath, and in that collective inhalation I heard the full cost of what I'd chosen. The applause I had imagined in private never arrived. There was only the low, stunned sound of people trying to reorient themselves to a new reality. I felt strangely small in the middle of it, a strange reversal. The person who had just pulled the rug out from under a giant corporation suddenly very aware of the thinness of the plank under my own feet. My hands trembled the tiniest bit. I wasn't sure whether it was from adrenaline or the sudden loneliness that settles on your shoulder like a second coat. I took a breath and let it out slowly. The crowd's silence was a loud testament to the truth no one wanted to voice. I had won, but I had also burned the last bridges to a family that never quite loved me the way I'd hoped they would. The victory was mine, but the room made sure I knew what it had cost. I pushed through the swing doors and the hallway felt suddenly too quiet, like the noise of the ballroom had been left behind as if it never belonged to me. No one followed. Nobody from the head table, no family member, no investor. The applause I had imagined in my head before I walked in never came. Instead, I had a dozen strangers' eyes on me in that moment, and every one of them was judging whether I had gone too far or not far enough. My chest was tight, but it wasn't regret. It was the aftertaste of a decision you make once you understand what's at stake. I leaned against the cool plaster and let my phone buzz. Kelsey. I read her message in the glow of the screen. The interim team is on standby. The press release is drafted. What are your orders? Her words were plain and efficient, exactly how she handled everything back at the office. For a second, I just looked at the text, feeling like a stranger holding a set of keys to a house I didn't know I owned. Then I typed back, steady fingers, issue the release. Let's get to work. The hallway smelled faintly of flowers and lemon cleaner. Behind me, muffled, the string quartet tried to pretend the party could go on. Ahead of me was a door that led to the service elevator and the back lot, to the car where my shoes felt wrong and my hands felt oddly steady. I walked out into the night air, the hotel's awning throwing a halo of light on the sidewalk. A black town car idled at the curb. Alan was waiting, his suit too bright for the moment, his face creased with worry. He didn't try to hug me. He only said, in a quick, clipped voice that always made me think of boardrooms, "You did what you had to do." I didn't answer him with explanations. I only said yes, and that was true enough. On the drive back to the office, the city lights looked like little promises. I wasn't sure whose life I had just folded into mine. My own, the people at Davenport, the 2,400 workers who woke to alarms and punch clocks and bus schedules. But I knew where I belonged in that list. I belonged with the people who built things. That thought steadied me like a hand on the small of my back. When we pulled into the parking garage, my team was already there, faces lit by phone screens, the same look that people wear when the world is starting to change and they want to be on the right side of it. We went straight to the conference room. Julia, Dana, and 3 of my most trusted operations people were already there, the press release open on screens, the legal notes all plain and blunt without the usual fluff. Someone had ordered coffee like it was a war meeting. The air hummed with the kind of focus you get when there is no time for sentiment. "Morning," Julia said, not looking up from the laptop. Her voice was the voice of someone who could make complicated things sound simple. "The release is written. It says exactly what we need it to say. We control the necessary suppliers, we're stepping in to protect the jobs, and we won't allow mismanagement to destroy livelihoods." Dana clicked to a slide with a list. "Supply chain is secure for the immediate term," she said. "Our acquired companies will prioritize Davenport's orders, and we've got inventory to keep things moving for at least 2 weeks while we reset schedules. We mapped out the next 72 hours the way you might mark safe routes on a map after a storm. Town halls, supplier checks, payroll guarantees, press statements, and a clear line showing who talked to whom." Julia kept it simple. "They'll try to buy time, they'll call for meetings and put out denials. We need to be faster. We need to be clearer. Town halls at the plants tomorrow. A staff message today. Keep investors calm but keep workers calmer." I felt the old thrill then, the one that had kept me awake in a tiny rented garage for nights on end, thinking through supply lines and people and the long, slow architecture of a company that actually served people, not reputations. Alan paced the room once, then sat and folded his hands. "The lenders will likely try to push back," he said. They don't want panic, but we've made our position clear. We own the suppliers and a majority of the debt that matters. We control the outcomes." He used the words a board member uses, but Julia and I looked at each other and translated them into plain language for the rest of the room. We had the power to force choices that would keep the company running, and we were ready to use it to save jobs, not to bury a family name. We split tasks. Dana took supplier orders and the plant schedules. Julia coordinated legal and media strategy. Kelsey, who'd linked into the call, would handle the public messaging and the employee communications. I would go out and talk to the workers myself. The team was sharp and small and tired in that way people who do this work are tired, like they've run a marathon and are waiting for the next lap. I didn't have the luxury of feeling proud. This was work. This was the part I loved the most. My phone buzzed. "Dad," I almost didn't pick up. Old scripts wanted me to answer, to soothe, to take on the emotional labor of patching things back together. But then I remembered Mark, the theft, the way he'd used his job to hide his gambling. I remembered the factory lines, the men and women who punched time cards and had mortgages and sick kids and couldn't absorb someone else's mess. I answered, "Hannah?" His voice was tiny, not the public school administrator voice he used at family meetings, but the man who'd once bandaged my knee. "Your mother, she's beside herself." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it for the scene as much as her. "She's upset. Can you help him, for the family?" His words fell like something I'd heard 100 times growing up. "Please smooth this over so we don't have to look broken to the neighbors. There is no family script where I can fix this and everyone gets to go back to pretending," I said. My voice was steady. "Mark stole from the company, Dad. He used his position to funnel money out. That money's traced to gambling sites. He has to face what he's done." He tried a different tack. "Can't you be lenient? He can make amends, repay it. We can handle this quietly." I heard the tired ache in him, the years of choosing what kept the peace over what was right. "Leniency would mean someone else pays for his choices," I said. "Are you willing to let other people's paychecks be at risk because your son can't control himself?" Silence on the line, then a small, broken noise that might have been a yes. "Can't you help him just a little?" he asked finally. "No," I said. The word felt like iron, but it was true. If Mark wants help, he needs to earn it. He needs to take responsibility. "I won't be the one to cover for him." There was a long pause. I could hear his breath. "You make it sound so simple," he said finally, and I think he was trying to teach me mercy as he'd thought of it, a kind of numbing kindness that left everyone hurt but not challenged. "Simple isn't always easy," I said, "but it's what's fair." I ended the call. It hurt like taking a bandage off, but when I hung up, it didn't ripple into 1,000 apologies from Mom or some desperate plea from Mark. It just closed, a clean break. For once, the person in the room with the most at stake wasn't the one expected to hold everything together on everyone else's terms. By dawn the next morning, I was standing on a makeshift stage in the main plant, the smell of oil and warm metal in the air, the echo of footsteps and machines around the cavernous space. 500 faces looked up at me, hands calloused, sleeves rolled, coffee cups held like shields. They had been awake before me and would be awake long after. My sneakers felt like anchors against the concrete. "My name is Hannah Blake," I began. My voice carried not because I raised it, but because the space and the truth made people line in. "Yesterday you heard some things about your company. I know a lot of you are worried about paychecks, schedules, and what tomorrow will look like. I'm not here to give you corporate talk. I'm here to tell you what we are going to do." I told them plainly what happened. That the previous leadership had let things fail, that I had stepped in to stop the collapse, and that I had bought the companies that made the things they needed to keep working. I didn't use big words about restructuring or leverage. I said, "We own the suppliers now, and we've already arranged for those suppliers to get your orders done. We're going to make sure the lines don't stop." There were skeptics. There are always skeptics. A man in the second row crossed his arms and said, "Prove it." So I did what leaders often forget to do. I offered them plans they could hold, not promises they could ignore. We set up a schedule for payroll guarantees. We posted the names and faces of the interim managers who would be on site. We organized a forum for grievances. We promised to send teams to the smaller vendors who might be in trouble and to make sure they were paid. When someone asked whether I planned to sell off pieces of the business to make a fast profit, I answered flatly, "No, I'm not in this to profit off your work. I'm in this to build something that lasts and keeps people working." That line got a quiet murmur, not the roar of headlines, but the better sound. Practical relief. At the end, a woman named Rosa, who'd been with Davenport for 22 years, came up and touched my sleeve. "If you can keep the place open, you'll have my thanks," she said. Her eyes were wet but steady. "My husband, he's ill. That's my paycheck." That one sentence, one life named, made everything feel real in a way press releases never could. I promised her then, not with polished corporate language, but with the honest grit I'd built everything on. "We will do everything we can to keep your job," I said, and I meant it with every quiet part of me that had ever soldered a board until dawn. Walking back to the office later that day, my phone filled with messages from managers, plant leads, and a few reporters. The noise had changed. It wasn't just gossip anymore, it was work to be done. The wedding was a memory fading at the edges. The real day had begun, the day of fixing and of keeping promises. I let myself feel tired then, a deep, clean exhaustion. It was the kind of tired that comes from moving toward something that matters, not running away from something ashamed. They stood in my lobby like two people carrying a sign that said regret. Mom's cheeks were flushed with something like shame, and Dad kept tugging at his collar like he needed a seam to hold him together. They didn't have an appointment. They didn't call ahead. They walked in and found me at my desk, the old workbench right where they could see it, nails darkened by solder and coffee rings etched into the wood. For a moment they just looked at the bench like it was a relic from a foreign life. "We want to apologize," Mom said, and the words came out stiff and careful like someone reading from a script she'd never practiced. Her hands twisted in her purse strap. She looked smaller than I remembered. Dad's mouth kept forming the shape of the words he might have used when I was a child, the ones that smoothed everything over for the neighbors, the ones that had always made me the one to bend. "We're sorry, Hannah, for how we treated you." I watched them. The office smelled of printer toner and hot coffee and the faint mineral tang of the lab next door. Their apology was late by a decade, but it arrived with the freight you expect from a delivered box, no extras, no apology card inside. I could have accepted it and let the great wound of years be sewn up with a clean seam. I could have promised to visit more and pretended the betrayal of my brother, the public humiliation, and the years of being spoken about like an embarrassment never happened. Instead, I gave them something that would cost them nothing and mean everything, a choice. "An apology is a start," I told them, "but it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't fix the jobs that could have been lost or undo the lies or put Mark back into a place of trust." Dad's jaw worked. Mom blinked, as if the idea that words alone weren't enough was a strange new concept. I slid a brochure across the desk toward them, the glossy kind with smiling faces and small piles of numbers. "North Star has a small business fund," I said. "Starter loans, they're not handouts. They're for people who have plans and are willing to do the work. No family names, no favors. If you want to start over, this is the road." "It's honest." Mom's hands hovered over the brochure like she was touching a map to a country she never expected to visit. "You'd help us," she whispered, and I saw the old hunger there, the need for someone to make life easy for them. "We can't just hand you money," I said. "That's not how this works, but we'll give you guidance. There are classes, there's a process, you'll have to earn it like everyone else. That's the point." They stayed longer than I thought they would, sitting in chairs that weren't part of my usual meetings, holding onto an apology and a brochure like two thin anchors. They left with a promise to think about the program, and as the door closed behind them, I felt something both light and heavy at once. Forgiveness didn't come. I didn't hand it out like a business card. But I had drawn a line and offered a way across for anyone willing to walk it. 6 months later, the chaos had quieted into a new routine. The newspapers called it the Davenport debacle for the week they could sell the most ink. After that, people moved on. Davenport Group became a division of North Star and the factory floors kept running. We launched 2 new products using the Davenport lines and our microchip tech. The first one was a small, reliable device that people actually needed. The second was a more ambitious piece of engineering that landed better than any of their previous flops. They weren't miracles. They were steady, practical steps towards something that worked. Mark's story ended the way most stories like his do, when someone gets caught in the back room of a courthouse with a plea deal and a reduced sentence in exchange for naming others in a wider web. He was swallowed by the consequences of the choices he'd made, and I didn't go to any hearings. He called once, a short, hollow voicemail where his voice sounded like paper. I never returned it. Valerie filed for an annulment the day after the wedding. Her family didn't have the stomach for the headlines, and she moved on in a way that made sense for someone protecting a name. Franklin Davenport stepped back into a quiet life somewhere his PR team thought would keep him out of the papers. His pride, the one he'd used like armor, had been dented beyond repair. The social crowd that had once sneered at me with small smiles suddenly wanted meetings and favors and introductions. I didn't take their calls. My time wasn't for sipping champagne and smiling. It was for keeping factories open, meeting suppliers, and sitting in noisy plant cafeterias answering hard questions with plain sentences. The cost of that choice was visible every night when I walked into my apartment. The phones that used to ring with check-in calls from Mom or a bragging text from Mark were quiet. The household that had once carried my name like a coat I didn't fit had unraveled into separate pieces, Mom and Dad living somewhere smaller and quieter, a house sold to pay for the social fallouts, and a silence that felt like an unlit room. My parents didn't take the loan from the small business fund. I heard through Alan that they had sold their house and moved to a town with shorter drive times and cheaper lawns. Maybe they were finally living for themselves in a quieter way. I hoped it for them, but it didn't stitch the missing nights back together. Sometimes the quiet in my apartment felt like peace, like the kind you earn when you stop pretending to be what someone else needs you to be. Other nights it felt like a void, a round hole where a voice used to be. I had chosen respect over love in the messy old sense, and it felt like a solitary throne. Kelsey, Dana, Julia, Alan, and the team at North Star became the family I chose. They were the people who answered emails at midnight and who sat in factory town halls with me when words mattered more than pride. They were the people who showed up, and when I needed to remember why I'd started all of this, I went back to the workbench. Not my executive desk, not the glass table where board decisions were announced, but the old, beat-up slab of wood with burn marks and gouges where fingers had learned to be steady. I kept it by the window in my office, right where the city lights made a soft, glittering horizon. On some nights I'd sit there sketching ideas in pencil, the same way I did in the first garage, fiddling with a circuit, reading a component, thinking about how things go together. One late night, head bent low over a new schematic, the city spread out below like a map of small fires, I thought about the folding chair by the service door, the place where Mom had told me I belonged. I pictured the ballroom again, silk and crystal and the shocked faces, and I smiled a tiny, private smile. They were right in a way I never could have admitted to them. I didn't belong on their glittering stage. I belonged where the real work got done, in rooms that smelled of solder and oil and coffee, surrounded by people who made things with their hands and plans that could stand up to a midnight test. The empire they tried to humiliate me out of was mine because I had built it from the ground up, in a garage no one thought much about. I kept the workbench near my window as a promise and a warning. It reminded me that power is quiet most of the time and that the loud rooms are often the ones that need the most fixing. If you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, pushed to a back table because someone else wanted the front row, I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below. Hit subscribe if you want more stories about people who turned being overlooked into their last, loudest word.